show. I am so excited to bring to you Merle Saferstein. Merle, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
I
Just
am I'm
thank
so
you.
excited you are, and I would love for you to start with how did you get into writing?
Okay, so when I was about 9 years old, I used to write letters to family. I had family all over the country, and I used to write letters. And I remember telling myself that I need to lead an interesting life so I have something to write about. And so I've never really been have had formal education in writing, but I have always written. So I'd say around the beginning of junior high school, I started having pen pals, and I'd say about seven pen pals from all over the world, and just was so excited every time I got letters from them. And then I think in ninth grade, I started keeping a diary, and I kept a diary for a little while and then stopped. In the meantime, started actually journaling in 1974 when I was 30. I had taken a Gestalt class and had a notebook and had pages left over. And it was my 30th birthday. And I thought, oh, I'm going to just write. And so that began the journey of journaling for me. And I journaled pretty regularly, but not as much as by 1982 when I really started writing. And in 1982, I bought a book on writing and read it, and it said, in order to be a writer, you need to write and you need to have a project. So my husband and I were celebrating our 15th anniversary that summer, and I decided to write him a book. So that was my first official writing project. And I wrote an 80-page book about our life and experiences. And then I started journaling every day, sometimes multiple times a day, and continued doing so. And then I guess in 1983, I quit working for a little while and I wrote a novel that was in letter form. And I did that because letter writing was for me, the most natural thing, because throughout my life, I just continued to write. And so that's how I got started.
Okay, so you just mentioned something that I think is really powerful, which is writing, but sometimes the writing, some people might think of that as being too formal in the sense like I have to just sit down and write this thing that's so profound just to get started. And what I hear you saying is that you sat down and said, I need to unleash whatever is going on in my mind, whatever that is, for however many sentences or paragraphs or pages that is. So if it's just a few lines, because that's what I needed to journal out, to write out, then so be it. If it turned into a few paragraphs, great. If it turned into several pages, it sounds like it was more cathartic at first for you to really write, and therefore a, a way to kind of not focus on the craft so much of trying to hone writing as much as just this was a vehicle to just express your thoughts.
Well, without question, it was not anything formal. And and I was not looking to produce anything. I think in the beginning, honestly, it was more a recording of my life. For some reason, I had a need or desire to record. And it got to the point where I needed to make sure that I had my life down on paper. And I don't know why. And I questioned myself all the time, like, why is that? At some point, I realized, and that was more like diary writing than journaling. And then at some point, I understood that I have a lot of stuff I don't really need. It didn't matter how many miles I jogged that day, or how much I weighed, or what I ate, or who my kids had over. I mean, that was not important to me. But what was important was how was I feeling? What was I doing? What was I processing? And then began to really understand the huge benefits of journaling, one of which is how cathartic it is.
So when you were going through this, and you just said something about like this, you felt like this calling, this pull, this intrinsic motivation, as I'm thinking of it, that to say, I've got to see where this will go. I mean, how did you would you talk a little bit more about that? Because, to your point, sometimes when you hear that little inner voice, sometimes you almost kind of think of, what are you wanting me to do? Are you kidding? And then other times you have to realize this is something you need to do, even when it feels different or uncomfortable or just unusual to you, but it's still the right thing for you.
Right. So there are a lot of, there are a lot of different factors in that. One of which is some people hesitate to write something down because they're afraid someone will see it. So that's one issue. And I was never really afraid of that because in my family, we really trusted one another. And the truth is, I could leave my journal open anywhere. My husband would never read it. He says, I live with you. I know that's enough. My kids were great about that. My daughter kept a diary and I never opened it. I mean, there was just this element of trust. Um, but also, I think that there was a point at which I wondered, and it was more than just an interest or a desire. It almost became an obsession or a compulsion. I I couldn't go to bed at night if I hadn't written, and I would literally carry a journal with me everywhere. And so if I was stopped at a railroad track, I would be writing. If I was waiting in line at the bank, I was writing. I mean, I was all every anyone who knew me knew that I was just keeping a journal. Um, so at some point early on, and I don't know, maybe in the late 80s, I don't remember exactly the year, I remember writing to myself and saying, I wonder what I will do with this. I wonder why I'm writing so compulsively, and I wonder what will happen with these journals. And I just kept writing and periodically would say, what is this all about? Because it was excessive and I wasn't really sure why, except that I knew I had to.
Okay, so with that, how did you make this transition then from taking the volumes and volumes that you're writing and realizing that the thing that you were meant to do with it was to create a body of work that you publish about. I know you're doing two volumes and that the second will come out in 2023, but the first is out. And so what is that like in the sense that you had to make that transition, or when you were making that transition?
So the transition came this way. I wasn't sure what to do with them. I had originally kept my journals in a safe deposit box at the bank, and then I kept them in two safe deposit boxes at the bank. And then when it got really expensive, I bought a huge safe. It was 700 pounds just to bring it in because it's fireproof, and it was not because I didn't want someone to read them, which I didn't anyway. But it was really I didn't want them to burn. We had had a fire in our house, and I guess ever since then I realized that that's what I wanted. So I I just at some point I knew that I thought I was going to leave my journals to my children. And I was talking to a young friend of mine, and she said, I really think that that would be a burden. And I was shocked. I was like, what? Because if someone left me their journals, I would be ecstatic. I would love to have someone's journals and see their life and what they thought and what they felt and what they experienced. But beyond that, what I realized at some point was that my journals have things in them. I mean, I really write for myself. I do not write for anyone else. And so there's stuff in there that no one has to see. It's really for my eyes only. Also, throughout my life, people have confided in me. And some of the things that they've told me have been so intensely personal and heavy that I need to process what they've said. So I will go home and write about it. And I had an experience where one of my friends called me at work one day and she said, will you meet me at lunch? I said, yes. We went to lunch, and I didn't usually even go to lunch when I was working. But I went because she said, I really need to talk to you. And she laid something on me that was so heavy. And she said, you can't ever tell anyone this. And I said, okay, I will not tell anyone. but I went home and journaled. And about 3 days later, she called me and she said, "It just occurred to me that you probably wrote about this. So I'm just going to ask you if you would go back and white out my name." And I said, "No problem." And I did. Um, so, so I was really torn with, what do I do with my journals? And I went through a process. And the first chapter of my book is called Journey of Journaling. And I talk about that process, making the decision, talking to a therapist about it, asking people, if I left you my journals, what would you do with them? So it was that kind of experience that I was going through, trying to understand what to do. And I came to the point where I realized I couldn't leave them to my children. And I also knew that the educator, teacher in me had something to say. And I was curious to know, there's got to be something in these journals that's worth sharing. And so in 1994, I took a 3-month leave of absence from life, basically, and I went to the beach and I stayed at a small motel at the beach, and I started going through my journals. And I actually wrote a book called A Necklace of Pearls from 60 volumes of my journals. I had an agent who I later learned, this was well before the internet, but when I looked him up years later, I learned that he was one of the 20 worst agents named in the United States. So that's okay. It was experience and it was exciting at the time. But what I realized when I went back and looked at the book was that it was really a lot of fluff. And I really didn't talk about the real stuff, because at that point I was 50 and I wasn't really willing to divulge my, the really personal things. I just felt that I wasn't ready for that. So that book is still in a drawer somewhere in my house. But then at some point, I knew that I still wanted to share some of this. And I knew that I needed to really go back and look at it. So in 2002, I began the journey of really intensely working on looking to see if there's something in this book in these journals that's worth sharing.
So when you did that, when you were looking through that content, did you start by just, because you're sifting through a lot of information, was it initially like just reading through things and then taking notes? Was it reading through and saying, I need to identify these themes? Or was it something that you said, I think I want to write this book and I want this kind of message or theme, and therefore I'm going to find the right pieces to align with that theme and distill from there. So how did you kind of work
Okay.
through that?
So I initially started by listing topics, and I had 70 different topics. I just kind of each day would think about different things in my life that might be topics worth sharing. And so I had 70 topics. I had 359 journals that I was going through. At the end, this book is from 359 journals from 1974 to 2016. And what I would do, and it was crazy, really crazy. I would take the little post-it notes, the smallest ones, cut them in four. On the top of the pages, I would indicate the date so that I'd have the date. And then whenever I came across a passage, a paragraph, an excerpt that I thought I might want to share, I would put a post-it note with that topic: parenting, marriage, the Holocaust Center, spirituality, whatever. Who am I? Where I've been? Just a list of them. And then, so it would take me anywhere between, I'd say, depending on the journal, between 5 to 8 hours to read and go through a journal. So mind you, I was doing this over a 14-year period. It took me 14 years to go through these journals. And then what I would do is on my computer, I would have files. So I would have a file for each of the topics. I would go through the journal, and in each journal, for example, there might be something going on that kind of becomes a theme within the journal. of course, they all interweave. There's no beginning and end to any one journal. But for example, if something big was happening at work and it took time over a period of time, that theme would be noted more. So then I would take the first thing I would do is take the themes that were the biggest and go through my journal and actually separate, put these excerpts on. That process took probably 4 or 5 hours to do that with each journal. And then the other thing I would do is if I came across things that I wanted to share with people, things about my friend's life, my family's life, I would mark those. And at the very end of the journal, I would then go through, type up those, and send them as emails to people. And I did that for two reasons. One, because I really thought that they would enjoy it, which of course they did, but also because I thought it would be helpful for the people in my life to understand what I was doing. And if they could just see a little piece of their life that I was pulling out, imagine what I'm doing with my life. So that was the process. And that process, like I said, took 14 years. There were topics at the end, Jen, that some had 75 pages, 75 pages of excerpts. There were a few that had 450 pages.
Wow.
So then it was the next 6 years of going through and whittling it down to approximately 30 pages a topic. And then deciding, well, first I decided which topics I definitely wasn't going to share. And some of those I just deleted from my computer because I knew I never wanted anyone to see them. And then deciding which were going to go in volume 1, which in volume 2. And so that's how that process went. It's very complicated.
Well, but it sounds like you also gave yourself the space and time you needed, because going through a lot of information, especially when you're trying to figure out, how do I organize this? How do I communicate this in a way that makes meaning for someone else to read versus me writing for myself? I mean, that can feel overwhelming. So how did you, it sounds like you gave yourself some permission, if you will, to go at a slower pace if you needed to take breaks when you needed to. But what else did you do to help keep yourself moving? Because something like that can be a big task, and it can feel a little daunting if you're not setting yourself with the right expectations.
Well, especially when you have as many journals as I had, and knowing how many. So there were years that I didn't do a lot of work, that I just in fact said, forget it, I just can't do this now. And I was working full time, and I was, a parent, and life was going on around me. In the summer of 2016, I spent 77 days. I literally dropped out of my life once again. I decided that I was not going to do anything except the few things I did. I was volunteering at Gilda's Club, which is a cancer organization for people impacted with cancer. And I was doing a writing group with them. I did not want to give that up. And my walks on the beach, I wasn't giving those up. So every morning I would go walking, and then I would come home and literally sit at my desk and work on this for all day long until my husband came home at 5 o'clock. When he came home, I would make dinner while we were talking, have dinner, leave the dinner table, go back to work, and work till 11 o'clock. I did it for 77 days, and I kept thinking, who could be crazy enough to do this? But I was at the point where I just want this done already. If I don't just do this, it's not going to get done. And of course, then the pandemic came, and everyone in the world was sitting home day after day. And I said, oh, maybe it wasn't so unusual that I did that. But the truth was, the journey going through my life, there was a period where I was entering the period in my journals where I knew it was really a tough time, that we financially had a really tough time, and our marriage was, I won't say it was rocky, but it was really tense. And my husband said to me as he was leaving for work one day, he said, are you going to be upset with me all over again? when you read this? And I said, I don't know, we'll see. And he came home one day, I was ready to kill him. And he said, okay, I got my answer. But the truth is, I mean, in every life, there's good and bad. Going through the good was great. Going through the bad was really, really brutal, because I have it all written down. I wrote so extensively that it's like, our memories are one thing, but when you've got it in writing and you can't run away from it and you can't make it something different than it is, it's a whole other story.
Yeah. Yeah, I can totally understand that. So, how did you then, or did you make adjustments with various entries that you had to take it from you processing things and writing for you to writing for someone else to read, consume, to learn from, to benefit from? What kind of shifts did you make in your writing to transition that form?
That's a good question. So basically, and I would say initially, I did not put in a lot of the tough stuff because I just wasn't sure I was willing to share it. But I have a friend who's a psychologist who kept saying to me, Merle, the shadow side is what people are going to relate to. And we talked about it a lot. And then I went through and read the first draft, and I said, this is not as deep as I've gone. And there is people will learn more from the difficulty and the journey of what I went through than they will from just reading all the great stuff that happened. And I also, the teacher in me was really interested in what are the lessons the life lessons that I'm imparting in this. And so I went back to several journals and I ended up adding stuff. I always read the first draft to my husband, but then after that I went back and read others and said, okay, this is it, and put stuff in. So I'll give you an example. My daughter, who is now 50, was sexually abused when she was 10 and 11 years old. I did not know it. We did not know it. And as an educator, to not know that, but in the early 80s, this was not something that was talked about. The first time I ever even heard about sexual abuse was um, one of our state senators, Paula Hawken, came out and talked about how she had been sexually abused as a child. So, and here I was an educator. I directed a camp with 350 kids. I taught school. I was doing all that and never even considered that this was a realistic possibility. So Rebecca had been sexually molested. We did not know until she went to college and came home and told us. In the book, I did not write about that at all, and that would not be something that I would put out there to the world. In the parenting chapter, I I sent that chapter to both my kids before I shared it with anyone, and I said, I want you to be comfortable with what I've written. And and so Rebecca called me after she read the chapter, and she said, Mom, is there anywhere in the book that you talked about being sexually molested? And I said, no, I just alluded to um, in two paragraphs how, and in this parenting chapter, how sometimes we don't have control over what happens to our children. That society comes in and does something and it's out of our control. And she said, oh, I totally skipped that altogether. And it was the weekend that she had told us about it, but that was the piece that I left in. She said, Mom, I really think it's important that you include it. And I was shocked, realized that how much she had grown, the work she had done. And she said to me, people hear from the person who's been abused, but they don't hear from the parents. And she said, I think it would be really helpful for you to, for others to read how you and Dad reacted to this. And so in my book, I went back to my journal, took it out, read it. It was not easy. It was something that I put away and hoped to never read again. But I put in the excerpts. I called her. I shared them with her. And after each chapter, I write a reflection on the chapter. And in that reflection, I explain that this was not something that I initially included, but it was Rebecca who asked me to include it because I wouldn't want a reader to think, well, that's a lot of nerve of her to put her daughter's story out there like that. Following that, at the end of every chapter, I have journal prompts. So I have a page of journal prompts where people can write, hopefully, either something that stirred them from what they read, or a prompt that relates to the chapter. And then I leave 2 pages at the end of each chapter for people to write. And I did that because I want this to be interactive. While it is about my life, the reason I'm sharing it is because I want people to look at their own lives and to understand that how we live our lives becomes our legacy. And how I've lived my life, and that's why the title of the book is Living and Leaving My Legacy, is I'm showing you. I'm showing you one example and hoping that the reader will read it and say, oh, I learned something, or I feel the same way. And because it takes over a 42-year span of my life, what I think will be helpful is different age groups will identify at different places. So a new mother might be relating to when my kids were very young, and someone who's a grandmother might see how I felt when I became a grandmother. And it's the same through marriage and through some of the other chapters. So that's how I feel about the importance of sharing this and why I am sharing it. And also to help inspire people to journal, to understand the power and the value of journaling.
But so all of that is absolutely like, uh, it's amazing. And the fact that you listened to what your daughter asked for and said, hey, how can I do this? And what she was asking was actually also a way of saying, what from your perspective? So it was your vantage point. That's another way of not just teaching, but healing. And I think that that's beautiful because I think that when you are writing things, to your point about a shadow side, there is a healing that you allow for yourself, but you also allow for your reader to kind of like, you're kind of like holding their hand saying, you don't have to do this alone.
Right.
I get this, and I don't want you to feel alone. So hold my hand, and we can do this. And I think that's kind of what you created in that space, just as from what you shared here. So I think that's amazing. I think
It
that's
also,
amazing.
thank you. It also led to a really incredible conversation between the two of us. I mean, we've had conversations through the years, but this took it to a new level completely. When she saw my words and my feelings, um, it really shifted things, I think, in that respect. Yes.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. Merle, this is amazing. Thank you so much for for journaling and for sharing, but taking the time to really figure out what that was and not letting that to distract you, because to your point, when you keep writing and then you sort of start to feel like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? What am I doing with this? But you kept going, you kept seeing it through. And that's such a powerful thing, because that's about finishing it, and that's about also taking it to the next, its own next chapter of sharing and of serving others. And so thank you for doing that. How can
Thank you.
people connect with you? How can they get your book? How can they stay in touch with you?
So I have a website. It's Merle R Saferstein, MERLERSAFERSTEIN.com. My book is available on Amazon and all stores that people would buy books at. And I am on all social media with my name on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, on LinkedIn. And so that would be the way. And I would be happy to have a conversation with anyone who is interested in journaling or in something that the book brought up for them.
That is awesome. Thank you so much for being on this show. I am so glad you were here.
Thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.